his Bachelor of Science in Biology from Cal State, Los Angeles, and then a PhD also in California on ecology, evolution, and marine biology from UC Santa Barbara. Corey spent 15 years as a professor and founding faculty member, I don't know what that means, but you might tell us, in the Department of Marine Science at Cal State Monterey. Not only that, he's also worked as a research ecologist within the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center, where he served as science head for the Long Islands study. Corey, thankfully, has now seen the error of his ways, and he's joined the University of Washington, where he is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in our college. And best of all, he is a professor here in SAPS as well. Corey's research focuses on the use of unscrewed aerial systems, GIS, image analysis, statistics, and machine learning, with the aim of studying spatial dynamics in coastal ecosystem. He also focuses on the development of programs to increase diversity in ocean sciences. Today, Corey is going to talk to us on his ongoing work on how drones can be used to provide new data collection platform. Please join me in welcoming Corey Garza.
Well, thank you, everyone. So it's always fun to get to talk about the science side of my career. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about how my group is using autonomous technology, things like marine machine learning, image analysis, to get sort of a different perspective on the structure and composition of marine systems, but also different types of insights and questions that the use of new technologies can lead us towards. So first, I just want to start with a review a little bit here, just historically, like how we've kind of studied marine systems. So, I mentioned I went to UC Santa Barbara. It means I came out of a very traditional sort of ecology program, the way that we study systems. And traditionally, these are some of the tools that we've used, not necessarily all of them, but the majority of what we use, things like quadrats. That's actually a picture of my quadrat when I was working my PhD back in the mid-90s. I can see the technology has not changed much. Transect surveys, cages, that's another one of part of my PhD study there. It takes about a month to get all that stuff into the rocks, and we're still using a lot of that today. Scuba, those are some of my former graduate students when I was back at Cal State Monterey Bay. Now, for this field of marine ecology, these have been pretty valuable research tools for us. It's what we had on hand at the time to give us data, helped open up a lot of different types of investigation, perspective on marine systems. But we're really starting to recognize that there's some limitations with these tools, right? And in particular, some of the tools that we're seeing revolve around sort of the spatial and temporal coverage that we get using it. Well, for one thing, that quadrat, I'm not going to get sort of a survey of the entire West Coast with that thing there, right? It's not logistically feasible. And temporally as well, like you just don't have a lot of time to study marine systems. I work in the intertidal mostly. I've got really 3 good hours to work. If I really hustle, I can get 5 hours out of it. And that's about it. That's what you have, right, in that time. If I'm on scuba, way back when I was really an active scuba diver, it'd be 40, 45 minutes. And then that was about it, right? That's what you got there. But the challenge we're running into is that a lot of the research questions that we're facing in marine ecology these days, especially with issues around climate change, these tools, we need different tools to keep up with the multiple spatial and temporal scales, right, that things like climate change are acting upon. And so we really need to kind of revisit how we get information these days. And Kintage back in 2013 published this review back in Science, and it was part of a National Academy study that was actually focusing on the UNOLS fleet back then, which is the National Research Fleet. Because one of the issues that we're running into is people wanted to keep up with the change in the climate at a global scale in the ocean. The problem is you just can't churn out a global class oceanographic vessel every year. And the other hard reality that folks like NSF, Office of Naval Research know we're facing is that they just don't have the budget, right, to do that. And so this was a workshop organized by the National Academy to talk about what is it that the next generation of ocean scientists, what types of tools are they going to have to be able to use? What type of approaches we have to use? And what came out of that workshop was a report that this next generation, what they were calling the 21st century ocean scientists, has to have a lot of technological capacity in their background, right, to take on some of the big challenges that we'll be facing. See this picture of a glider, right, autonomous gliders going in the water. This is the first article I ever see that mentions eDNA that I can recall, that a different way of measuring biodiversity in there. So a lot of different new technological approaches came out of this particular workshop. And a few years back, NOAA started to adopt, right, some of these. So every about 5 to 10 years, they released their science and technology focus area. So they came about, I think, when Tim Gallaudet was the interim director. This is what NOAA sort of is suggesting, or in some grants mandating, that either you train students in, or that your NOAA-funded research has to have some component of. There were 6 of them, but 3 of the big ones that popped up to folks because they hadn't shown up before were uncrewed aerial systems, drones, artificial intelligence systems, the types of things that power, right, your uncrewed systems, an omics strategy involved. So in other words, NOAA is really starting to think about like how we have to incorporate different types of technology. And in fact, I just put out a letter of intent for a recent NOAA competition. One of the first things that's on there is you have to be using uncrewed aerial systems using remote sensing approaches, right, part of it. So they really are starting to invest in this. And so one of the things that we're going to have to come to grips with in the marine ecology world, whether we want to or not, is automation is coming, right? And what we really need to start to think about is how we're going to start to incorporate these emerging tools into the type of research that we do and the types of questions that we're looking to answer in the marine systems. So what I brought up here from Monterey is a kind of a marine technology and ecology program. So I mentioned I was one of the first, I actually helped start the marine science department back at Cal State Monterey Bay. We were clear, we did not have a lot of money. And so I used to joke that we had to take a Moneyball approach to actually doing in there, that we weren't going to get the big home run sluggers. So we needed other ways to be competitive research-wise, right? I wanted to work with a colleague of mine, Rick Davidic, who used to run the seafloor mapping lab there, was what is that next generation of mapping going to look like? Drones were just starting to really come out on the market. They were relatively inexpensive back then. What we now model is kind of a research and education program, right? The one uses marine technology to study marine systems, but also train students. Most of this is funded by California Ocean Protection. We have more foundation funding, NSF and NOAA. One of the great advantages of what we're doing with now is we actually get much broader spatial coverage and temporal coverage. So in other words, data over a really big area in a relatively short amount of time. Now, one of the things that does cause some of my colleagues a little bit of heartburn who have very traditional field approaches is we don't have to be outside a lot. I was doing intertidal surveys with Quadrat. I'm looking at 4 to 5 hours. The drone 10 minutes. And instead of a crew of 4 to 5, it's the pilot and an observer. And so it's really changing the way that we're doing research out in marine systems. So some of the drones that we have here, if I can get this to go. Back one here. There we go. One more click. Yeah, there we go. And so this is just kind of a summary or a quick snapshot of the drone infrastructure that we're currently operating with here in my lab. And so we have a lot of different types of drones because they're outfitted for different mission types or different types of data collection methods. What you're seeing up there is a drone made by a company called DJI. They're based out of China. They're probably the largest, and they produce probably the best drones that are out there. These are called their Mavic model. And so it's called the Mavic 3 RTK, which stands for real-time kinematics. What it does is it has a GPS type unit built into it that will autocorrect the positioning on the images every second down to the scale of a ½ centimeter or so in there. We have a couple of them. We name them by Syrian and Rhaegel. So those are the 2 small dragons from the Game of Thrones. And so we use these quite a bit in our intertidal mapping program. The big one here, this is a heavy payload drone. It's the DJI Matrice. One of the things we're able to do is we can output really heavy payloads on it. So we can simultaneously have a high resolution RGB, or the standard type of camera you use for images, on there and couple it with a multispectral or hyperspectral camera. We can also put a LiDAR system on that. We call that one Drogon. So that was the big dragon for Game of Thrones. That's actually us with some congressional staffers that we're meeting with about a month or so ago out at Taylor Shellfish Farm. We're kind of showing them some of our capacity. We also have these vertical takeoff and landing fixed wing drones here. So what they look like an airplane, but the way they take off is the props rotate upwards. It takes off like a helicopter. When it gets to its mission altitude, so you can take off here at Elkhorn Slough, props rotate forward and flies like a plane. What it means is it can fly for about 90 minutes, right? Cover a lot of area on there. We often use that for shipboard operations. We need to cover really large areas of the ocean, right? But we don't have a lot, but we have to do it in a relatively short amount of time. And then this is our latest group of drones. We call it the Rogue Squadron. A bunch of us are Star Wars fans in my old lab there. These are the paired Anafi AI drones. One of the really cool aspects of them is they have a 50 megapixel, 48 to 58 megapixel camera built into them. And we can fly them at a height of about 5 to 6 meters off the ground, right? So we get really high resolution, right? And some of the data that we're getting there. And so all these drones are doing lots of different types of things and getting us different quality type of information out of these marine systems. First things that we started to, I have to do something today. So one of the first things that we started to use the drones for was actually intertidal. It was kind of an easy thing to do. It was an easy way to get students out there, but it was something that was also of interest to the monitoring community in California. And so what we had is we initially started an autonomous intertidal mapping program. So you're seeing a photo there at Hopkins Marine Station. We're doing some of our early the ultra low altitude drone flights there. Often what we're doing with these is we're actually not flying them. You actually will have sort of flight apps built in by companies like Drone Deploy, Pix4D, Lychee, where you go in and you actually pull up, in this case here, a Google Earth map of the place you want to survey, and you draw your sample grid on it. You tell it, I want it to fly this high, I want you to take pictures this often, and you don't have to go out there. So that's a snapshot from Wrigley Marine Science Center out on Catalina Island. We just sit on the dock and the drone goes out, gets the data, it comes back right to us in about 5 minutes or so. And then what we're able to do is we can use Pix4D software, which is a digital photogrammetry software, and create these 3D, right, photorealistic models of the habitat that we're working on. So that's actually up in British Columbia, some work we did this summer. That's about, 3.5 meters vertical extent, about 30 meters along shore. The drone did that in like 9 minutes. You're there. Doing that by hand, I would have been out there for 3 or 4 hours collecting all that data. So this is actually one of our first field data collection profiles out of Catalina Island. It's a drone we don't use anymore. It's the Phantom 4 Pro. It's probably one of the more common ones that came out. But that's us actually getting it to fly about 5 meters above the intertidal there. And what it's doing is just doing a transect. Just like you would do a traditional transect, it's flying a transect photos, right, of habitat that we've been monitoring going back to about the early 1980s or so there. And so this is in general how a lot of our operations work with the drones. So what I want to do now is kind of talk about an initial case study that we were starting to use the drones for to help us get a better understanding of climate impacts on a pretty widely sort of studied ecosystem in California, the Rocky Intertidal. So this is some work I've been doing with collaborators. Carlos Robles, a former postdoc advisor of mine, Jason Smith, who's down at Cal Poly Pomona, Dale Sweetnam, who recently retired from NOAA. And what we've been doing is we've actually been working with about a 40 to 50 year data set, going back and looking at changes in mussel bed cover in the Southern California Bight. So Jason is working as part of Marine, which is multi-agency Rocky Intertidal network. They documented sort of about a 30 to 50% decline in mussel bed coverage in the Southern California Bight. So that's the area going from about Santa Barbara down to San Diego is what they were noticing. And so there were some proposed causes. He wrote a paper about this. There's some causes that got thrown out there. One, you just got a lot of tourists trampling everything, and so that might be what's causing it. Issue was they were also surveying in military sites, so like Vandenberg Air Force Base, for example, just a little north of Santa Barbara. You were seeing the same declines there, right? So it kind of sort of removed human impact, right? Or visitor trampling is one explanation. Heat kills, increased global temperatures, aerial and water temperatures is another one there. Increased sea surface temperature was also proposed, right, as another potential cause there, right? And so it's something that we're starting to be looking at, like, are these some potential things that are driving these declines that we're seeing? The other thing we started thinking about were the predators as well. This is a big thing. If you're getting the decline, does it have something to do with shifts in predators? Now, one of the things that's not, people sometimes forget about Southern California, it actually didn't look that different from the Northwest not too long ago. So the picture on the left there, that's a place called Crescent Bay in Southern California. That's Orange County, like Disneyland, Anaheim. That's what it used to look like back in the early 70s. When I show people that picture without context, they think it's like Catchoosh Island. It's actually Southern California back in the 1970s. This is just ecological information that was kind of lost to my generation, right, of ecologists. The other predator that's out there, and again, it's another ecology that we've forgotten about, a specific spiny lobster. People often sort of associate it as a kelp forest predator. Gets associated with like fall time lobster diving. They're actually keystone predators in the intertidal. So Carlos wrote about this in like the late 80s, early 1990s. What happened, spring, summer, they shift, the females in particular shift their diet and they move up into the rocky intertidal to start feeding on mussels over there. The reason they're doing that, a former grad student of mine worked this out. It's the lipid content in the mussels, because that's the time of year that the females are brooding eggs, and you need the lipids there to support the egg production. And what happens is they flip back to then going into the subtidal in there. And so that's the other big predator that we have there. So when you start to look back at what's been going on in the Southern California bight, you can look at some long-term sort of climate data. So this is mainly mean daily air temperature going around Los Angeles, going from about 1906 to 2023. There, and there's been a shift. There's been an upward trend in the air temperature. So it seems that yet we do have one environmental factor that's been changing over time in the Southern California bight, air temperature, right? And that's important for mussels because they're exposed, you know, for about 6 to 12 hours on the day, depending on a low tide. So that increased air temperature is going to introduce an increased stress on that system. The other one has to do with sea surface temperature, where this is going to have impact. It's on the productivity, the plankton, right, in this case, right, the food supply that mussels are getting because they're foragers. What you're seeing here, right, is in the red line there, the black line, sorry, it's the running mean that you're seeing. So that's the long-term mean, the straight black line in the middle. The annual running mean has been increasing over the long-term mean, right, coming up into about the 2010s, going back into 2020. So what's happening is sea surface temperature, right, has been slowly increasing in the Southern California bight. So it seems that we have these two climatic shifts, right, that have been happening over the long term. And so the sites we decided to study were 3 sites in the Southern California bight, where one, we have about 40 years of data, right, to take a look at this effect, right, but they're also not sort of influenced by upwelling, right? So we can also reduce that as a confounding impact on this particular system. So I'm going to go through these sites and kind of just go back in time a little to show you how these things have changed. So this is Cabrillo National Monument, which is just around San Diego. These are images from Joy Zedler and Jack Engel, who've been working there. Jack's retired. He was at Santa Barbara for a while. Joy moved to the University of Wisconsin back in the, I think, the 1980s. And so it's kind of a boulder field system down there with mussel beds on it. And this is what it looked like in 1976. Went back in 2023, the same boulder, and this is what you see, right? Everything's gone. And so this is a pattern, right, that's repeated over time. One of the things that we're kind of thinking about is how can we start to extract data out of these? Are actually, this is data, right? It's not data that we're used to getting normally. It's not like with your quad and your notepad there, but there's data. And so there's lots and lots of these slides. We're starting about what's an approach that we can use to start to extract data, right, out of these particular images here. And that's when we started thinking about the drones and sort of emerging technology. So one thing that we started to recognize with these images is there's landmarks on all of these images that you can go back today and find over there, right? If you work in the geospatial sort of realm there, you know that if you have a landmark you can go back and find, you can get coordinates on it, right? And once you get coordinates on it, it allows you to do something called rendering of images to that. So in other words, you can start to make a photographic map that you can then put into a GIS database from which you can then extract data from. But the first thing we need to do is to actually get a digital elevation model, right, or a terrain map of those systems so we can start to render images, and that's where the drones. So what we're using is we're using that real-time kinematic system that I talked about a little bit earlier with some of our drones there to go back to all of these sites and create high-resolution digital elevation models, or DEMs, in here. We would then have coordinate systems built into it that were accurate down to about a ½ centimeter or so. And then what we do is you go into the GIS space and you can render images, right, onto that DEM. When you put it into GIS, you can then start to subgrid it out, right, in here, extract data and do things like percent coverage estimates or actually individual counts. The other thing that we can do, which has been a big leap for us, in the early days of doing this type of work, we used to actually pull everything up on a screen and count it by hand. Right, so when I was a postdoc working on these types of things back in the early 2000s, I would spend like holiday times there, like with a computer screen and like 1 mussel, 2 mussel. It was quicker than doing it in the field, but it was still pretty time intensive. Now you can use machine learning approaches to go in and auto-classify the images. right? One way you can do this is you can use different properties here. So for example, ulva will reflect light back at one wavelength that's different than coral and algae will, right? And so you can train the software to pick up differences based on those wavelengths. You can also use something called object-based classification that will pick up the shape of mussels, for example, classify anything with those shape parameters into one habitat category. So you're seeing an example up here from Canada. You can kind of see there's like a black wedge there in the middle, which is a mussel bed taken from the air. Software has actually gone in and classified it into these black pixels here. So the way that we get percent coverages out of here, let's imagine you have 1,000 pixels in your image. The software goes in and tells you have 500 of those pixels that are classified as mussel bed. You now have an estimate of about 50% mussel cover in there. Right, and we've gone back and ground truth this quite a bit, so we get about 92 to 95% accuracy, right, with that. So it's got a pretty high rate of accuracy in terms of estimating what's mussel versus non-mussel. Great thing is, it takes us a couple of hours to train the software to do this. Once you get it going, you can get some of these things classified in a matter of about 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the speed of your computer. So this was a test case that a former graduate student of mine, Mason Donnie, did, where he then, okay, that was a new image, but can we actually do these on the paper images? We actually were like rendering stuff from slides. I had to learn how to process slides, right, when I was undergraduate. So we had to then scan these in, but his question was, can I actually go in now and classify off of these things we scanned in? Turns out he can't. So this is actually him doing some of the machine learning on a paper photo or traditional photo paper from 1990. He got about a 93% accuracy rate on this. So what this is telling us is not only can we use sort of modern images to do this, we can actually go back in time and use those images and pull that data out of it. And so this is just kind of some preliminary stuff that we've been working on here, but what you're looking at here is Cabrillo National Monument. So the red dots there indicate the lower level of the bed there, the blue dots, the upper boundary there. What you'll notice over time is those blue dots there, they stay at the same height. They don't shift over time. There's no statistical difference in the boundary height of the upper boundary there, staying pretty consistent over time. The red line is the lower boundary. So over time, it's been moving up the shoreline over there, right? To the point where right now, when we went back most recently, you can't tell the difference between the upper or lower boundary, right, on those beds. For all intents and purposes, there's no bed there anymore is what we're pulling out of the data. Another site we've been working on is Bird Rock out on Catalina Island. So there have been cohorts upon cohorts of graduate students and researchers working out there. It's where a lot of the lobsters are at. And so this is actually where we have probably the richest data set in terms of looking at mussel bed loss. So what you're looking at here is a data set, a photographic data set going back to about the mid-1980s. It's kind of the same. What we're looking down here is the blue dots there. That's your lower end there of the bed. Red line up there is the upper end of the bed. What you'll actually see, and it's actually also giving us some insight into oceanographic cycles, is over time, you'll see those blue dots are moving up and up the shoreline. What you'll also notice is they'll move up and then they move back down. Those upward movements always seem to coincide with El Nino years. Those bounce back, they come back down, are the La Nina years. You'll see there's this year here, about 2016. The blue and the red dot there are one and the same, where the bed was all pretty much gone right at that point. And then it bounced back with the La Nina year, and then it started moving back up again with the El Nino year. So what you're seeing is, even though the bed always goes, you get the lower boundary coming back down, it always resets at a new height over there. So it's slowly ratcheting up after each one of these successive El Nino, La Nina cycles is what it looks like is happening out there. And here's just the photo documentation of that pattern. So that's the mussel bed out on that west end of Bird Rock in 1989. Big dense mussel bed. 2016, when I started going back out there, it's all gone at that point. And then it slowly bounced back again after the last El Nino La Nina cycle there, where you're getting the mussel bed and it's filling in at this lower boundary here, but it's not back to the extent where it was right in 1989. And then this is that Crescent Bay site, the one with all the big sea stars on it that looks like Tatoosh Island. There, same pattern here, the lower boundary are these red dots here, upper boundary are the blue dots. You can see going back to 1972, where that bed was at. And over time, it's progressively moved up the shoreline to, again, where it's just a thin line of mussels at that bed. There's been some recruits that have come in the last year down on that lower end. So those would be the shiny little mussels. We haven't gone back to see if they're still there or not. Right, so they've come back after that recent El Nino La Nina cycle. But again, what it looks at, it's happening is over time, you're getting this ratcheting up or compression of the mussel beds across Southern California. It looks like a lot of this coincides, right, with shifts in aerial temperature and those shifts in the El Nino, La Nina cycle that's happening in Southern California. But what we take away from this particular original example here is that these kind of rising sea surface temperatures, right, and atmospheric temperatures together, they're kind of a double whammy on mussel beds over there. When they're exposed at low tide, they're kind of cooking on the rocks, right? We've seen some of that up here in the Pacific Northwest during some of the really hot summers. But then what we're also getting hit is when we're in the water column as plankton, they're not doing so hot. They're physiologically stressed. A few that do make it on shore, they don't really recruit successfully. The ones that are there, right? Well, what you're trying to see is they just don't have a food source to sustain themselves once they're on there, right? And so all these things are sort of working in concert with each other, right, to impact these mussel beds. The other thing that we're seeing here is there's potentially some elevated metabolic activity that's happening here. You know, Eric Sanford, who's at UC Davis, did a lot of work on this, so that during these El Nino years, that tended to increase the physiological demand on sea stars, and so they eat more over there. And so that's another explanation people have been looking at as another impact on there. Same with spiny lobsters. A former student of mine, Taylor Eddy, published on this, that during these kind of hot periods, the isotopic sort of composition of lobsters down there, they tend to have this kind of muscle component built into them at a pretty high rate in there. But the key part of all of this is we weren't able to get to all of these patterns here without using the DEMs from the drones, right, in this case, where the technology was allowing us to go back in time, recreate an ecosystem that no longer exists, and then we're able to extract that data to inform sort of modern insights, right, onto those systems. Now, that's just one example of, you know, how we're using integrating drones into that. And what I want to do here is just kind of give you a few other examples of things that we're doing now with the drones. So this is Hopkins Marine Station in Monterey Bay. It's run by Stanford University. It's the oldest marine station on the West Coast. This is a project we were on that was jointly funded by NOAA and NSF that popped up during the pandemic. One of the challenges they had is they were trying to teach students, but had no way to get them out the intertidal. So we brought the intertidal to them. So this is a digital recreation of the intertidal at Hopkins. So this is the Hewitt line. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's a transect line that a graduate student, last name of Hewitt, in the 1930s for their thesis. So what they did is they actually just went and documented everything on the transect line, and that was their PhD thesis. Like I saw the maps, with really detailed hand-drawn maps of that. In the early 90s, when people were thinking about climate change, back then people were calling it global warming, people were thinking, well, if we're actually seeing that, let's go find, because we actually, one of the predictions was that you're actually seeing increasing water temperatures there. You should see fewer what people refer to as northern species on the line, relative to what people refer to as warmer water southern species on the line. So Jim Barry at Mbari went back with Chuck Baxter. They found the line. It was an old brass bolt, a couple of them that they had hammered into the rock, and they went and they found the bolts, resurveyed the line, and that's actually what they found. They found that there were more what people considered southern species, right, on that line relative to what you saw in the early 1930s. And it was considered some of the early evidence for some of these climatic shifts. You know, people have gone back for some methodological issues with it, but that's what they found, is that they did see a shift. And so they go back every year and survey that. And so we've actually digitized that for them, both as a research tool, but as an education tool. We're also starting out, you know, spinning up work here as well up in the Pacific Northwest. I've been working just out on Vancouver Island at Banfield Marine Sciences Center. It's a consortium marine lab run by 5 Western universities there. We're actually going and we're digitizing mussel beds that have data going back to the 1980s here. So this is acting as a little bit of a refuge for some of these climate impacts. And so we want to get a sense of what these communities actually look like as well. The other thing that we've noticed with this is even though we had sea star wasting, there wasn't as big of an impact, right, on these mussel beds that people were predicting because of declines in sea stars. So this is something that's being funded by the Moore Foundation right now for us to actually go up and start to digitize all of these habitats using the drones. Right, and a big part of what we're also doing with this is we're trying to use new sensor types here to extract data in ways that we might not be able to in the past. So what you're looking at there on the left, that's one of our field sites from the air out of one of these islands nearby, traditional RGB video. This is a multispectral view of that. We're looking at non-visible light. Right, and what you're able to pull out of that are different types of species to pull out of that you wouldn't see with the RGB there. So in other words, multi-spec lets us see elements of those habitats that we can't see with your normal sort of spectra of view here. And so it's one of the things that we're starting to test out. What type of additional information can we pull of these coastal habitats using sensor approaches that we haven't used in the past? Other ways that we're thinking about this as well as I don't just work in the intertidal. We're also looking at habitat restoration and how to use drones to assess the success of that. One of the big projects we worked on prior to me moving here was down at Elkhorn Slough. So it's one of the largest wetlands in California, but they're doing a massive restoration project. Not only are they recreating a lot of the habitat there, they're actually elevating the tidal height. In other words, they're replanting pickleweed at a height that's about a half meter above where it normally would be at. It's a mitigation strategy against sea level rise. They won't want to restore these plant communities and have them be underwater 50 years from now. But it's a big area. It's like a 30-hectare area that they need to survey to do that. It's too big for quadrats and meter tape like we normally do, so we use it with the drones over here. And you can see this is one of the photogrammetry models that we have there, where we did about 30 hectares of area in about 11 minutes. We're there at a resolution of about 1.2 centimeters, okay, from a height of about 300 feet or so. All right, and we started to publish on some of this. So this is Alexandra Thompson, who's a former graduate student with us here, where she actually went back and used the drones to create these GIS layers here, where these are all the habitat components you pull out of the drone data where you could actually see where either of these combinations of underlying habitat types are sort of habitat features that you want in order to have a successful restoration project here. And so in other words, what she's doing is she's creating GIS maps to help inform future restoration projects there to try to enhance the success, right, of those projects. And then she spun this, she got a paper out of this in Estuaries and Coasts, then wound up as a California Sea Grant Fellow right afterwards. Other things that we're doing, we got pulled into the world of kelp forest monitoring. I am not a phycologist at all. Like, how did you wind up working on kelp? The pandemic. I got a phone call one day, Corey, we understand you have a drone program. Yeah, well, we usually use scuba, they won't let us out on boats. Can you help us out? And so we got into kelp forest monitoring. So part of what we did is we were working with partners from the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, where they've got a long-term project monitoring bull kelp there. And so we actually go out every year now with them, and we do about 90 kilometers of shoreline along with a team of volunteer scientists who actually happen to have drones as well. And so it's actually not just a science project for us, it's a large community science project along the Sonoma coast. And what you get out of that is you actually get pretty cool maps that pop out of that. So this is just one example from Sonoma coast here to give you an example of the type of data that you pull out with the drones here. So this is about 1.5 kilometers of shoreline here, going about 500 meters offshore. And just to give you a sense where we're at, we're in that little tiny point in the middle of the circle there. So the drone did this in about 50 minutes or so. Took a couple of batteries to do this with. Again, we're flying at a height of about 400 feet and getting a resolution about 1.5 centimeters in there. And you can see the bull kelp up in there that's extracted from that. So you can actually see the individual bulbs, right, that are popped out of that. So again, it's changing the way that we're getting information out of these systems. But one thing I do want you to sort of think about with this is it's not just a data gathering exercise. Either like here's all the way we get data and we go good luck with that, right? It also helps to give you a new perspective, right, on the ecology of marine systems. And I want to kind of go back in time a little here to when we were first really getting into coastal remote sensing and digital photography. So going back about a decade or so, my colleagues and I, Rob DeJarnay, Megan Donahue, and Carlos Robles, we were starting to take theory from the field of landscape ecology and applying it to intertidal systems, right? Because we started to realize there were other processes that structure these systems outside of some of the interspecific mechanisms that we normally worked on. Challenge that we had is the patterns that were coming out of these models were at scales that the tools we had at the time weren't able to keep up with them. Right, we really only had quadrats and meter tape. Like, I don't know if this is going to work. How are we going to test these models? Digital cameras just came out, right, about then. It was the early 2000s. So we had a 5 megapixel camera that cost us about $1,000 because that was considered high end back then. So Megan and I devised camera riggings where we would actually have these cameras on these big metal riggings. We had this metal worker who created them for us, and then we would just sort of like, we were our own drones, I guess, and we would just walk these transect lines that we had set up shoot these photos, and we had a group with a total station. If you're driving like on the highway, you see the survey crews, that's what we had on there. And so we're able to sort of collect these really big areas, right, of the shoreline, but actually put coordinates on them. It was the first time people started doing that. We were able to pull out really cool GIS models, right, of these systems here. It was the first time people started doing this. And we actually were able to publish a whole series of papers on this because we were able to pull these patterns out and test these models. It led us sort of look at new mechanisms that structure these systems. We were able to revisit some of Bob Payne's early work on equilibria states, right, in density systems, kind of revisiting these systems and re-envisioning them as having these multiple unstable equilibria states, was something people didn't realize about these systems at the time. We were able to sort of tease out new mechanisms of boundary formation, like why boundaries showed up where they were, why they were fractured, or why they were really intense. We were able to pull that out, again, just from these landscape models. Megan went and revisited disturbance ecology and rethinking how we thought about disturbance dynamics, right, in these systems, revisiting some of Joe Connell's, right, and Wayne Stusso's early work on that. Then I got asked by landscape ecology to do a large review on how we can start to sort of integrate technology and sort of rethink the way that we do research on these systems. And so it really changed up the way that this particular group of ecologists thought about looking at the systems and types of questions, right, that we started asking. And in fact, we're starting to see some of this in other systems, right? With that kelp forest paper, that kelp forest work I talked about, we just recently published on that in remote sensing and ecology and conservation. So a colleague of mine from the Nature Conservancy, Vienna Sakamoto, was the lead author on this. And so this is a snapshot, an aerial snapshot from one of our drone surveys there. What you're looking at the top there in panel B, that's kind of a satellite snapshot of it, right? The two ways that you normally get kelp forest data is either you go out there with your scuba gear, measure all of it, or use satellites. Well, that's a satellite image up there on B, the interpolation that you get in terms of kelp coverage. So this, again, this is bull kelp. This is what you get with the drones. You'll probably noticing there's a lot more sort of area that's being filled in there. So in fact, what's going on here, when you look at it, the drones were picking up patches of kelp recovery in these areas that were being missed by the satellites because the recovery is happening at too fine of a scale for the satellites to get at, but at too big of a scale for the divers to get at. So what the narrative became was one of kelp forests on the decline to, oh, they're actually on the rebound. And now the question is why? Why are these systems more resilient than we originally thought they were? So again, it's opening up a new avenue of investigation right in this system. This here, the pilot in there, it's a recent student of mine, Charnel Wycliffe. So she was my final student at Monterey Bay. She just defended about 8 months ago. She was doing some work with a group from San Diego State and Mossang Marine Lab with rhodolith community. So they're shallow subtidal coral and algae. They're like little balls of coral and algae, but they're an important habitat. So she was wondering if, well, one, can she just use drones to start to monitor these systems? Now she can. She did a lot of work with the scuba divers, did a lot of ground truthing, used a lot of the machine learning approaches. What she pulled out of that was, on average, the drones were picking up more rhodolith coverage than the divers were. Again, what changed the story here was the story was rhodolith beds were on the decline. Turns out they actually weren't. There's a lot more rhodolith than people thought. It's just that the survey approach that we were using. Yeah, in fact, she just got this accepted in aquatic conservation as part of a special issue on the ecology of rhodolith communities. So again, the drone is actually opening up new perspective on that system, new ways of thinking about dynamics of those systems, and new questions. Why are these things more resilient? Why are they behaving in ways that we didn't think about before? All right, and we're starting to see new funding agencies start to invest in this as well. So this is part of a new project I have with Pete Ramundi at UC Santa Cruz, working with the Ocean Protection Council, and what the state of California wants to do now. They want to move into fully autonomous habitat mapping for the coastal environment. And so what we just up is a big round of coastal mapping where we now have statewide digital elevation models for about 120 long-term rocky intertidal monitoring sites. And then part of the oceanography group at UC Santa Cruz to create predictive sea level rise maps. In other words, state not only wants to know where these sites are at, but they want us to model what's the impact of sea level rise going to look like on these habitats. We actually have the models to be able to do that with now. We didn't have those in the past. We need the DEMs in order to do the modeling for that. We're also moving into the world of charismatic megafauna. I am not a charismatic megafauna person, but I got pulled into it. This is another project funded by the Ocean Protection Council. We're working with Dan Costa's group at UC Santa Cruz and Barbara Block, Stanford, and then Jason's course at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. For the state of California, they're really interested in how coastal pinniped dynamics or shifts in the variability of their haul-out sites, how that's predicting or driving the presence or absence of great white sharks, right? Especially where people go swimming. This got funded because there were 2 attacks in Monterey. That happened to happen within like a week or so of each other. And so the state like, we should probably start to get a better understanding of what's driving some of these interactions. A big part of it is people tended to go swimming where all the sea lions were around. Like, oh, sea lions, when you go swimming in there, well, there's something else swimming in the water. So what we're doing is we're using drones here to do monthly surveys of these sites to get a better sense of, one, how these sea lion to the haul-out sites are changing every month. But then also, Barb's got these great white sharks tagged, right? She's seeing how they're reacting, right, to those shifts. And we're getting these long-term predictive GIS maps out of this. But one of the big aspects here, Michael Espriello is a postdoc in my lab. He just got hired by Washington Fish and Wildlife. He'll be starting a new job pretty soon. He created some machine learning approaches for classifying different groups of pinnipeds out here. One of these sites here has like 1,000 on them at any time. That takes a long time to count. So he's been using some deep learning approaches in ArcGIS Pro, where he can take an image here and look at these little gray guys there. Those are the elephant seals. The brown ones are the California sea lions, where the software can go in and tell the difference between the two and then give you a count, right? So it takes you about an hour to go through these big stretches of the shoreline and tell you, right, you got 50 elephant seals and 900, California sea lions on there. So again, it's really changing up the type of data we get and how quickly, right, we can start to analyze that and get an estimate on change in these systems. And then we're also starting to think about, like, how can we start to push marine technology more broadly out into the research and education community? So this is part of another project that we're on, funded by the Moore Foundation. It's being headed up by CENCUS, which is part of the IUS network. It's a Central Northern California Ocean Observing System. And it's a partnership with MBARI, Stanford, when I was at Monterey Bay, now Washington, and UC Santa Cruz, where the broad goal is, how can we start to sort of, one, help support the development of new marine technologies, but then get those out, right, into the research and education community. In some cases, local communities that just might need access to a drone. Like I used to work with tribes in California. Sometimes they needed access to a drone for monitoring, right, their resources. One of the projects we're working on right now is doing some initial testing around how can we sync up a large network of autonomous systems to facilitate monitoring of offshore wind farms. So some of you might be familiar, there's a potential new marine site, marine reserve going down in California, the Chumash National Marine Heritage Site, right around Santa Barbara, Point Conception area. Right adjacent to the boundary are wind farm leases that have been sold. And so the state's interested in, okay, how do we monitor that? And so one of the things we're being tasked with is trying to see, can we deploy a whole network of these things together for a fully integrated autonomous system where you've got underwater, you've got AUVs and gliders, you've got satellites, you've got buoys, you've got tag sharks, you've got my drones flying around. So we're actually testing this right now, right? We actually do cruises every few months to see how all of these systems are working together and can we deploy these things in like 3 to 4 years. So, that's where we're at with the research, but as I mentioned, as Andre mentioned, I'm also the associate dean for DI. So whenever I do my research, I also think about how can I use my technology to kind of engage people, right, who normally wouldn't engage in this, right? And so this is actually a paper that came out about 6 years ago now. And what it's really focusing on, it was focusing on sort of about 40 years worth of geoscience student diversity programs. And really what the takeaway was of, well, there was no progress. I'll just walk you through this really quickly to get a sense of what's going on. So panel A there, that's degrees in sort of the different geoscience, earth science like geology, ocean science, where I was in, atmospheric science. B is, it's degree attainment by sort of demographic breakdown. White, non-Hispanic, Native American, Asian American. You can see the white non-Hispanic is a black line, pretty high, right? Again, these are all sort of US demographics. So to see what are considered minority demographics in the US, you actually got to zoom in. So that's the zoom in over there. They're only looking at 3 groups, Hispanic or Latino, Native American non-Hispanic, Black non-Hispanic. Asians, even though they might be considered minorities at the larger demographic level, then STEM, NSF does not consider them. And that's why I got pulled out in this particular paper, if you're wondering why. But you can see, again, there's not a lot of degree attainment in there. You can see the one blue line for Hispanic or Latino that's gone up, slowly keeping with population shift. The reason I have that circle there, like 2001, you see like 5 in ocean science. So I'm like one of those 5. Like, so that's just even put a face to the data for everyone over there. So, right. But one of the things that I think, like, we know there's a lot of sort of barriers people talking about: hiring practices, access, resources, all of these things. About 3 years ago, Oceanography approached me about writing an article about what are some things you don't normally think about when we think about barriers, right? And I think about like marine science, like what are barriers we don't think about? And then I was an editor on a special issue of Oceanography that deals with some of these things. Well, some of the ways we tend to depict ourselves or the field itself can itself be a barrier, but we just don't think about it that way. We always have these like active field-based activity, right? It's always like, I grew up with Jacques Cousteau. That was my introduction to it. Right? But whenever I show pictures of this to my family back home, like, oh, you're just hanging out on a boat, just at the beach, right? And that's the impression, right? Because the impression of a scientist is you got a lab coat on, or you're looking at a board with equations, right? So it doesn't always scream science, right? So that tends to be one barrier we don't think about. This need to travel away from home, right? I always needed to wander out of my neighborhood. Most of my family never left the 3 or 4 blocks right there in East LA. Right? And that's pretty normal over there. Right. And that's actually the opposite of what we think about. Even the college model, right? The traditional college model, it's kid turns 18, get them out of the house, turn their room into like the exercise room or whatever it is, right? The entertainment center. Not the community I came out of, like the expectation is you stay within a couple blocks so you can drive grandma to the market. Or I used to get that a lot, or bring money into the house. So it's a very different model that we don't think about. That requirement for purchasing really expensive equipment and clothes. Again, those are my grad students, right? That was all bought off the grants that I had, right? But again, there's this impression that, ooh, I can't buy $1,000 worth of scuba gear. I can't buy the $500 Gore-Tex jacket, right? Again, these impressions we don't sometimes think about. The depictions can appear hazardous. I will not name the institution that uses this as part of their research advertisement. Right. But if I show that to my family, my mom be like, Dios mío, mijo, what are you doing? It looks dangerous. Right? And so it's adventure. Like we look at it as being adventurous, but it's like, that was dangerous. And then, also, something I started thinking about in the last few years, especially with the drone program, if you have a physical disability of some type, it might not look accessible. When I started the drone program, the first few pilots I got, they're actually students with disabilities. Because they were told, one of them was actually told because they can't scuba dive, they can't be marine biologists. Right, because they had a medical condition. It's like, that's not true. And so we got into they're actually a drone pilot for Fish and Wildlife now. Right. But again, there's these other components we don't think about. So I kind of think about this, well, how can the drones help me sort of deal with some of this, or the technology? So COVID, I guess for better or worse, gave me an opportunity to sort of think about, right, some of this. So when I was in Monterey, I ran 2 big programs. So I ran a NOAA Cooperative Science Center, they're like big research and education centers, and I ran an REU program at the same time. The NOAA Center was only open to Monterey-based students, and that's actually Sarah Kilbane. So she was a Monterey-based student working in my lab. She was also a Part 107 commercial drone pilot as well. So she got all that as an undergraduate. These are 2 other students, Maria Rocha and Ariana Soriano. They're in the REU, but not for Monterey Bay. Monterey would not allow anyone on campus for there. So how do I get them a research experience? Technology. So Sarah, she was actually, what she was doing is she was helping me develop a lot of the low altitude flight parameters for the drone. So she was out a lot collecting data. Maria lived in Watsonville, a little bit north of Monterey. Ariana lived just outside of San Diego. There. What we started to realize is we could start to use cloud processing, cloud servers to facilitate this. So how this actually worked is Sarah would actually go out in the morning at low tide, get data, upload all of her information, all of her images into this Pix4D cloud server, where Maria and Ariano had online access to that. And we sent them laptops, sent them mobile hotspots. They would start to process all of that image for us. They would meet on Zoom, start to do all the image analysis, create digital photogrammetry models. They'd meet at a group, and then they would Zoom with me to check on the data over there. They all have jobs. Ariana just got her graduate degree from Scripps a few days, this past quarter or so. So but what it did is it created a new opportunity for students that would not have had that opportunity otherwise. And in fact, this is the research model that I use in my lab. We have a lean and mean field team. And then we have a team back here, a shore team, for lack of a better term, that can process data no matter where they're at because they have access to these cloud servers. So again, it was just, it helped me kind of think a little bit differently about how I create a research learning, right, experience for a student that might not have otherwise had that experience. Right, and then just, things like outreach and education, right? I still think about that a lot, like, how do I do that? It opens up new ways to introduce the public, right, to how we do marine science. Again, every time I talk to someone, I'm a marine scientist, like, you work on sharks. I guess now I do work on sharks. Normally I would say no, right? Or, Jacques Cousteau. I used to get a lot of that. Well, I don't do any of that really, right? But it gives us a way to introduce the public, right, to how we do research. Like that's Charnel, when she's out of Catalina, the gentleman, those are his grandkids. So like, hey, what are you doing? So she's like talking, like, I'm doing marine science, like, but you're not in the water. So it was really cool. The kids were having fun with it because it uses a tablet or smart device. It was something they knew, right? And so they were really engaged with it. That's Pat. He's a technician back in Monterey when I was there. It's a local news there. So we were working with a community science group that was actually helping to restore kelp in Monterey. So some of you might know about the group in Monterey that smashes urchins with hammers. That was there. They got a permit to do that. I don't know how they did. With a group of volunteer divers working for Reef Check, which is a big volunteer dive monitoring group. They smashed urchins and they wanted to show that doing that could restore kelp. It did. We provided the aerial surveys pro bono. So we went, and so it's a whole story about how these community members are helping to restore kelp forests. That's Pat again. He and I are in we're in southern Texas, working on a NOAA workshop there with a group of historically Black colleges and universities. These are students from Jackson State University, Mississippi. Again, we're introducing them to a different way of being a marine scientist with something they hadn't seen before. So we're doing a big drone training workshop with them as part of this. Right, and we're even thinking about like how to talk about how you study shark. Jason is part of that shark project there. He just sent this the other day. It's about ready to go, where we've got a huge education site about how we study great whites and pinnaheads. And what we're emphasizing is it's not like you see on Discovery Channel, like the person puts on like the metal suit and teases the great white. That's not how you do research. So he's talking about all the tech we're using from eDNA, genomics, the drones, Barb's tag. Barb refers to her program as the fish and chips program because all her tech has chips in it. Dan's tag, right? And that there's a lot of tech and like hard technical science that goes into this to help inform the public and help us understand, right, these systems. So again, the tech is really opening up new ways, not just to do research, but how we think about education and outreach and engagement. So really what I want you to take away from this is one, marine tech, they provide a pretty low cost and rapid approach for studying coastal habitat. Every time I talk about drones, like, oh, it's so expensive. Like, it's a one-time investment. It's like $3,000 on the low end, high end, maybe like $20,000, $25,000, but you're not paying that every year. We're there. Improved spatial and temporal resolution. We're getting a lot of information in a short amount of time at much, much higher resolution than I was getting using traditional methods. We're there. That improved spatial and temporal coverage, it's revealing emergent features in these systems that we didn't really quite think were there, which is opening up new questions and new avenues of research in these systems that we might have thought about otherwise. And then the thing that's really near and dear to my heart is you get this new avenue through which to sort of train the next generation of scientists, right? New tools to engage a generation of scientists that might not engage the way I was taught, right? I just feel like I was taught in a very different generation, a different way of engaging us back then, right? Thinking about these new engagement strategies. Again, if you're interested, you want to follow up, shameless plug here. We are on social media. We post photos wherever we go on there. So you want to keep track of us. I refuse to call it X or whatever it is now. We still have a site on there. We're on Instagram quite a bit, so you can see us on there. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Go back to the last slide. That's not really a question.
Yeah.
Drones are a nice low cost, or not low cost, but one-time investment. But like, what is the overall longevity of a single drone? And then also, how fast is technology? Because I feel like I'm the next year.
Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah, so drones, they're like a little better than a laptop. They're getting a good 6 to 7 years on a drone. So like the hardware will age out after a while, just like a computer will. So what I mean by one-time investment is you're not doing that if you buy one of those small drones, you're not doing it every year. The downside to that, oh, you asked about the other part, it's like iPhones. DJI likes to roll out, if you just bought the DJI Mavic 3, well, guess what? We just released the 4, and you're like, oh my God. So we try not to do that over there. The downside is eventually, like with Apple, they will stop supporting the older models, right? And that's happened with some of their original drones, they stop supporting it, so eventually you do have to turn it. But yeah, they're pretty low cost, but they do come with DJI, like to turn out a new model almost every couple of years or so.
What are your thoughts on like high resolution commercial imagery, like from Planet, for doing some of the same things that you're doing with drones?
They're good for certain things. The one limitation that I mentioned with, if you're talking about like satellite or like with airplanes, like with the kelp forest, is that they can only get down so far. Right. And that's one of the challenges that we had in the early days of that. Like satellite, you're getting down to like a half kilometer. There's a lot. And so if you're working on kelp forest, for example, a lot of those dynamics happen at a meter to subcentimeter level. So it can give you some insight on what's happening at a regional level. But if you want to know what's happening that kelp bed in Monterey Bay, you need drones to fill that gap in. And so usually how I approach it with folks is the satellites are great, right? You get like big coverage there. You can look at big regional shifts. But where the drones do, they help to fill in those scaling gaps, right? You really need to get in like, okay, what's happening in this part of Sonoma on there. And the other thing I tell folks too, because some folks, who are more in the traditional field-based stuff, hey, if your thing is your epibionts on kelp, like the drone's not going to do that, right? You still are going to have to do that with scuba. Because I also sometimes get that reaction, oh, like we're not going in the field anymore. You can still go out in the field, like put on the scuba gear, go out, because there's some things you can't do, right? You know, like intertidal, like the most common question, well, you're not looking under the rocks and in the thing. I'm like, well, are you actually using the data under the rock? I'm like, well, I don't know if I am or not. Like, right, it goes back, but if that's really what you're interested in, like you'll still have to get in there on your hands and knees and count all that stuff. Because I do have a colleague that does have like manipulators on drones, but that's probably 10 years down the road where you can do that. But you still have to get out there and flip the boulder to see what's under it, right? So there's some things that drones just aren't going to do.
I have a question. Oh,
Yeah, sure. I was gonna ask about, great talk, like shifting, like as your technology gets better, the resolution gets better, and when you're looking at really long-term data sets, how hard is it to kind of be like, well, they only counted 5 rodoliths, like with their eyeballs, and
Yeah.
counted 200
Yeah.
with our most improved drone technology, and having your ground truth do that. Do you have to do that even in between drone, like as your drones improve, or like how difficult is that process?
Yeah, we're slowly going through that. We're just starting to see that. So when we started using digital cameras, that was the question we got, like, how do you know what you're saying the muzzle or CSAR in the digital picture is what, the field technician said. And so we did a lot of ground truthing. Like when I got my first grant from USC California Sea Grant, they wrote that as a requirement. We had a piece code, some of you might remember the monitoring program, they allowed to monitor that we had to use their field protocol and compare them to our digital. And we did that and they were matching up really well. Now what's happening is people have now, they're catching up with the digital cameras, people are starting to use the digital cameras. And now what's happening is they're being asked to compare what people are saying are CSARs and muscles in the digital images they're getting with the handheld camera to what the drone and auto classification is saying is that, right? So we have to, every time that happens, that leap happens, you have to back compare to what the most recent thing was. The other thing that we're being challenged with right now, though, and that's something Pete and I are talking about, is, Marine, that big West Coast monitoring program, they just have years and years of hand collected data. And so right now the process is, how does what they're collecting matching up with what the drones are collecting? And that's the part we're just starting to sort of think about right now, but it is a process that does have to happen.
okay, well, your timing is magnificent, exactly 5 o'clock. So let's give a round of applause to Chloe.